Welcome to History Teller YT, where we journey through time to uncover the stories that shaped our world. Today, we dive deep into one of the most transformative eras in human history, the Industrial Revolution. It's a story of invention, ambition, and change, of steam engines roaring to life, factories stretching across the horizon, and cities swelling with opportunity and struggle. It's a tale of human ingenuity and human cost, of children and women working long hours, of labor movements, social reform, and the very birth of modern society. In the next hours, we'll explore every aspect of this remarkable era, from the spinning jenny and mechanized looms to the rise of railways and steamships, from the expansion of education and knowledge to the early stirrings of feminism and labor rights. We'll witness how the Industrial Revolution reshaped not only economies and technology, but culture, art, literature, and even our environment. We'll see how society transformed, how people adapted, struggled, and thrived amid unprecedented change. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why this era is considered the foundation of the modern world. Whether it's the engines that powered cities, the inventions that changed how we live, or the human stories that inspired reform and resilience, the Industrial Revolution is more than a chapter in history. It's the story of human ambition, perseverance, and transformation. Stay with us as History Teller YT takes you step by step into this incredible journey of machines, people, and progress. Before the thunder of machines echoed through England's valleys, the world moved slowly, bound by the rhythm of nature. Most people lived in rural villages, working the land their ancestors had farmed for generations. Life was simple but also hard. Families rose with the sun and slept soon after it set. In a small English cottage, a weaver would spend long hours at a wooden loom, creating fabric by hand. A blacksmith in a nearby village hammered glowing metal into tools. Horses pulled carts, windmills turned lazily in the breeze, and human labor powered everything. The 1700s were still a world ruled by agriculture. Nearly 80% of Britain's population worked in farming. Crops depended on the weather, and bad harvests could lead to famine. Trade existed, but it was slow. Goods moved by horse-drawn wagons or small sailing ships. There were no railways, no factories, and no great cities filled with smoke. London was already growing, but even it was a world away from what it would become. Yet beneath this calm surface, something was stirring. Science and discovery had begun to change how people thought about the world. The Enlightenment had encouraged curiosity, logic, and invention. A few clever minds began to imagine a different kind of world, one where human muscle could be replaced by mechanical power. These ideas would soon spark the most profound transformation in human history. But for now, the fields were quiet, and the rivers flowed gently through green pastures, unaware that soon their waters would drive the engines of progress. Every revolution begins with a spark, and in the case of the Industrial Revolution, that spark was innovation. Across Britain, thinkers, inventors, and entrepreneurs were busy experimenting, tinkering, and dreaming. The textile industry was the first to feel the winds of change. In 1733, John Kay invented the flying shuttle, which allowed a single weaver to do the work of two. Production speed increased dramatically, but it also created new problems. Workers couldn't keep up with the demand for thread. This, in turn, inspired others to invent faster spinning machines. By the 1760s, James Hargreaves had built the spinning jenny, capable of spinning several threads at once. Then came Richard Arkwright's water frame, which used the power of flowing water to drive machines. For the first time, production moved from homes to large buildings, the first factories. These early mills stood beside rivers, their great wheels turning with the current. Workers, often whole families, would spend long days inside, surrounded by the constant whirring of machines. It was noisy, dangerous, and exhausting, but it marked the birth of industrial labor. Meanwhile, science was advancing too. In 1765, a Scottish engineer named James would improve the steam engine, transforming it into a reliable source of power. This invention would become the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution. No longer limited by rivers or wind, factories could now be built anywhere. Steam power made it possible to dig deeper mines, transport goods faster, and drive the engines of ships and trains. The age of industry had begun, and there was no turning back. By the late 18th century, Britain had become the cradle of industrialization. Coal mines spread across the countryside, their black dust covering everything nearby. Ironworks roared with heat as molten metal poured into molds, shaping the tools and machines of a new age. Towns that were once small villages grew into vast industrial cities. Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool became symbols of progress and of the human cost that came with it. Thousands of people left their farms, drawn by the promise of steady work and higher wages. They packed their lives into wagons and moved to the cities. But what they found there was not the paradise they expected. The air was thick with smoke, the streets crowded and filthy. Children as young as 6 worked long hours in dangerous conditions. Yet even in this chaos, a new kind of society was forming, one driven by ambition, competition, and invention. Britain's empire also played a major role. Its colonies supplied raw materials: cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and metals from Africa. British factories turned these materials into goods and sold them around the world. Capitalism began to take root, built on trade, exploitation, and profit. The Industrial Revolution was no longer just a technological change. It was a social, economic, and moral one. Humanity had unlocked a new kind of power, but it came at a cost that would echo through generations. The 18th century was a time when fire met water and changed the destiny of mankind. Deep within the minds of Britain, workers toiled in darkness, constantly battling one relentless enemy: water. Flooding was a constant threat. Pumps powered by horses were inefficient and slow. But in this struggle, a revolution was brewing. When Scottish engineer James Watt refined the earlier Newcomen steam engine, he unknowingly ignited the next great chapter of human progress. Watt's design, completed in the 1760s, used a separate condenser that saved energy and made the steam engine far more efficient. Suddenly, machines were no longer bound by rivers or human muscle. Factories that once depended on watermills could now operate anywhere, in cities, on flat plains, or near coal mines. Steam engines powered spinning machines, looms, and hammers. In 1781, Watt's partnership with Matthew Boulton brought these engines to industries across Britain. The world began to hum with the rhythm of pistons and gears. Even as smoke blackened the sky, hope filled the hearts of inventors and industrialists. Steam became the heartbeat of modernity. Soon, this technology leaped beyond factories. Steam engines were attached to wheels, birthing the locomotive, and with it the age of railways. The first steam-powered locomotives in the early 1800s could haul enormous loads faster than ever imagined. The world shrank as travel times collapsed. Journeys that once took days could now be completed in hours. Coal-fed iron beasts raced across the countryside, pulling goods, people, and ambition along iron tracks that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The age of steam had arrived, and it was unstoppable. While steam gave the Industrial Revolution its power, iron gave it strength. In every corner of Britain, the demand for iron soared. It was needed for tools, machines, bridges, ships, and railways. At the center of this transformation stood a new breed of industrial pioneers. Men like Abraham Darby, who in 1709 discovered that coke, a refined form of coal, could be used to smelt iron more efficiently than traditional charcoal. This simple yet revolutionary technique opened the door to mass production. The blast furnaces of Britain burned day and night, turning raw ore into the material that would shape the modern world. In the foundries, molten iron glowed like the heart of a star. It poured into molds, becoming the gears of machines, the frames of locomotives, and the girders of bridges. One of the greatest symbols of this era was the Iron Bridge in Shropshire, built in 1779, the first bridge in the world made entirely of cast iron. It stood as a monument to human ingenuity, connecting not only two sides of a river, but two eras of civilization. The marriage of iron and steam was destiny. As steam engines grew larger and more powerful, iron became the essential skeleton of industry. From the massive spinning machines in Manchester's textile mills to the towering cranes along Liverpool's docks, everything was forged from this metal. The world's first iron ships began to appear, able to carry goods across oceans faster than ever before. Iron was not just a material. It was a symbol, cold, strong, and unyielding, much like the spirit of the age itself. It built the modern world, but it also chained millions to labor that seemed endless and unforgiving. By the early 19th century, Britain's transformation was nearly complete, but the revolution it had started was just beginning to spread. The Industrial Revolution was not a local event. It was a spark that leapt from nation to nation, lighting fires of change across the globe. Europe watched in awe and envy as British factories produced goods faster and cheaper than any competitor. France, Germany, and Belgium soon began to follow, establishing their own mills and mines. The world was entering an age of industrial rivalry. The steam engine, once a British marvel, now powered ships that crossed the Atlantic, carrying not just goods but ideas. In America, inventors like Robert Fulton and Eli Whitney began their own wave of industrial innovation. Fulton's steamboats turned rivers into highways, while Whitney's cotton gin revolutionized the textile trade, though at a terrible cost, reinforcing slavery in the American South. Meanwhile, railroads spread like veins across continents, binding cities and regions together. Britain, however, held the advantage of an empire. Its colonies became both suppliers and consumers in this new global economy. Cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, gold from Africa, and tea from China all flowed into British ports. In return, factories produced endless goods, cloth, metal, and machinery, shipped to every corner of the world. The Industrial Revolution had created a new kind of empire, one ruled not by kings, but by markets and machines. The world was growing wealthier, but also more divided. Progress at a price, one paid in sweat, smoke, and shattered lives. The Industrial Revolution did not only change machines, it changed people. As factories multiplied across Britain, millions of lives were uprooted. Once, families had lived in quiet villages surrounded by farmland. But the promise of steady wages and opportunity drew them toward the booming industrial cities. Between 1750 and 1850, Britain's population exploded, from 7 million to over 20 million. Villages emptied as workers poured into urban centers like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Glasgow. The transformation was breathtaking and brutal. Imagine a family leaving behind a small stone cottage for a cramped, smoky apartment near a factory. The father might find work in an iron foundry, the mother in a textile mill, and the children in a spinning room or coal mine. The sound of nature was replaced by the thunder of machines. Streets once filled with bird song now echoed with the hiss of steam, the clatter of looms, and the grinding of gears. The cities themselves grew almost overnight. Houses were built in rows, cheaply and quickly, often with no plumbing or sanitation. Streets became narrow, dark canyons between soot-stained buildings. The air was thick with coal smoke. The rivers turned black from factory waste. Diseases spread rapidly. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis thrived in overcrowded slums. Yet people kept coming. Poverty in the countryside was worse, and in the city, at least there was hope. For many, industrial labor was not just survival. It was the only chance at a future, however harsh. Behind every puff of factory smoke was a story of human endurance. The Industrial Revolution had created a new kind of society, one that worshiped progress but demanded sacrifice. The age of the city had arrived, and with it, the modern working class was born. To step inside a factory during the early Industrial Revolution was to enter a world ruled by iron, noise, and relentless motion. Giant machines dominated every corner. their gears spinning endlessly as belts whipped and pistons pounded. The air was hot and heavy, filled with dust, oil, and the ceaseless rhythm of mechanical labor. For the workers, men, women, and children alike, each day was an exhausting battle to keep up with the machines that never tired. A normal workday could last 12 to 16 hours, 6 days a week. There were no safety laws, no breaks, and no mercy for mistakes. A moment's distraction could mean a crushed hand or a lost limb. In textile mills, children were small enough to crawl under the spinning machines to clean them while they still ran. Factory owners saw this as efficiency. Society called it progress. Wages were low, and exhaustion was constant. But even in such grim conditions, people adapted. They sang songs to keep rhythm, shared bread during short pauses, and found pride in their ability to endure. Discipline inside the factories was strict. Supervisors, often called overlookers, walked the aisles with whips or sticks, enforcing order. Every second counted, every movement mattered. The factory was not just a place of work. It was a symbol of a new industrial mindset, precise, productive, and profit-driven. The old craftsman, who once made goods by hand, had been replaced by the machine operator, whose job was to feed and tend the machines. Human labor had become just another cog in the system. Yet this harsh environment also forged something powerful: solidarity. Workers began to recognize their shared struggle. The seeds of labor movements were planted in the deafening roar of these early factories. The machine had reshaped humanity, but in time, humanity would fight back. As cities grew and factories multiplied, the landscape of Britain changed forever. Green fields turned gray with soot, rivers carried waste instead of fish, and the skyline was pierced by the tall chimneys of industry. Progress had brought wealth, but it was unevenly shared. The factory owners, often called the new industrial capitalists, became immensely rich, while workers lived in misery. Huge mansions rose in one part of town, while entire families starved in the other. The divide between the rich and the poor had never been wider. Writers and thinkers of the time began to take notice. Charles Dickens, through novels like Oliver Twist and Hard Times, captured the suffering of the urban poor. Reformers such as Robert Owen tried to create better conditions, founding model communities where workers were treated fairly. Yet change was slow, and the machinery of profit was too powerful to stop. Factories kept expanding, railways kept spreading, and Britain's exports flooded the world. For many, the city became both a symbol of hope and despair. It offered jobs, culture, and modernity, but also poverty, pollution, and loss of identity. Traditional life had vanished, replaced by a world where time was measured by factory bells instead of church clocks. People lived by the rhythm of machines, and the very air they breathed was owned by industry. Still, humanity endured. Out of the smoke and struggle emerged the foundations of the modern world: urbanization, organized labor, public health reforms, and new ideas about rights and justice. The Industrial Revolution had built cities of smoke, but within them, the seeds of democracy and social change began to take root. The world was learning that progress came with a price, one that could only be paid by those who had the strength to survive it. In the shadow of towering factories, childhood was rewritten. The Industrial Revolution, with all its marvels, also birthed one of history's darkest realities: child labor. In the early 19th century, thousands of children as young as 5 worked long, grueling hours in mills, mines, and workshops. Their small hands and nimble bodies made them useful in places adults could not reach. But their innocence was crushed beneath the weight of machines that cared nothing for age or pain. In textile mills, children tended spinning frames, ran errands, and cleaned under machinery that thundered day and night. They would wake before dawn, trudging through fog and soot to arrive at work by 5 a.m. inside. The air was thick with cotton dust that choked their lungs. Many fell asleep standing up. Some never woke again after accidents. In coal mines, trappers, usually boys between 6 and 10, sat alone in darkness for 12 hours, opening and closing ventilation doors. Their only company was the echo of distant picks and the drip of water in the tunnels. Factory owners justified this cruelty by calling it opportunity. They argued that work taught discipline, that poor children would otherwise starve. Parents, trapped by poverty, often had no choice but to send their children to work. But the truth was simpler. Children were cheap, obedient, and expendable. Their small wages barely fed their families, but they kept the gears of industry turning. Childhood, once filled with laughter, games, and learning, became another casualty of progress. Yet amid this darkness, awareness began to grow. Voices of conscience started to rise. Reformers, writers, and even some factory owners who could no longer ignore the suffering that stained their profits. The cries of child workers echoed through Britain, and soon they would shake the halls of Parliament itself. By the early 1800s, the plight of working children had become impossible to hide. Reports of abuse, starvation, and horrific injuries filled the newspapers. Philanthropists and social reformers began to campaign for change. One of the most influential figures was Robert Owen, a Welsh industrialist who believed that workers, even the youngest, deserved decent conditions. At his cotton mill in New Lanark, Scotland, Owen reduced working hours, improved housing, and banned child labor under 10. His factories still made a profit, proving that compassion and business could coexist. Owen's ideas spread, inspiring early labor movements. In 1833, after years of public outrage and campaigning, the Factory Act was passed in Britain. It limited working hours for children and required factory inspectors to enforce the law. For the first time, the government acknowledged that industrial progress could not come at the cost of human life. Still, enforcement was weak, and many employers ignored the rules. Children continued to toil in hidden corners of the industrial world, in brickyards, chimneys, and match factories. Authors and artists also joined the movement. Charles Dickens, through his vivid storytelling, gave a voice to the voiceless. His novels exposed the cruelty of child labor and the hypocrisy of a society that called itself civilized. Public pressure began to rise, forcing Parliament to pass more reforms. The Mines Act of 1842 banned women and children under 10 from working underground. Later, the 10 Hours Act limited the working day for women and children to 10 hours. These were victories, small but significant. For the first time, the law stood between the machine and the child. Britain was slowly awakening to the idea that progress without humanity was not progress at all. The revolution that had begun with steam and steel was now being reshaped by conscience and compassion. Even as reform spread, countless children still lived and worked in hardship. But amid their suffering, they showed extraordinary resilience. They found joy where none seemed possible, in friendships, in songs sung quietly while cleaning machines, in tiny acts of rebellion against overseers who treated them as tools. These children grew up faster than any generation before them. Many could not read or write, yet they understood survival better than anyone. Their world was a paradox. Factories represented cruelty and hope at the same time. A child might lose a friend to an accident one day, and yet dream of one day escaping that same factory. Education became their key. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury and organizations like the Ragged Schools Union fought to provide free schooling for working-class children. Slowly, literacy began to spread, and with it came awareness. Children who once cleaned machines began to read about rights and justice. Some would later become leaders in labor unions, journalists, or reformers themselves. Proof that even in darkness, light can grow. By the late 19th century, Britain began to phase out child labor entirely. Machines became safer, education became mandatory, and the image of a soot-covered child crawling under spinning wheels faded into history. But the legacy of those children lived on. They were the silent builders of the modern world, the invisible hands that turned the wheels of progress while the world looked away. Their suffering forced humanity to ask a hard question. Was industrial growth worth its human cost? The answer came slowly through blood, sweat, and tears. But because of them, the world learned that progress must walk hand in hand with morality. The Industrial Revolution had shown humankind its strength and its conscience. The Industrial Revolution was not just a triumph of machines, it was a triumph of the human mind. Behind every piston, loom, and engine stood an inventor whose vision reshaped the world. These were not kings or generals, but ordinary men driven by relentless curiosity. They lived in a time when ideas could change everything, and they believed that through innovation, humanity could conquer nature itself. Among them was James Watt, whose perfection of the steam engine became the heartbeat of industry. But he was only one among hundreds. Richard Arkwright revolutionized textile manufacturing with his water-powered spinning frame, creating the first true factory system. Samuel Crompton's spinning mule combined speed and precision, weaving threads so fine they became symbols of British craftsmanship. Each invention built upon the last, creating a chain reaction of progress. The beauty of this age was its momentum. One discovery led to another. Iron smelting techniques led to stronger machines. Stronger machines produced better tools. Better tools built more efficient factories. Innovation was no longer rare. It had become a culture. The 18th and 19th centuries were an age of tinkerers, mechanics, and dreamers who transformed their workshops into laboratories of revolution. Even more remarkable was how invention began to break class barriers. Some of the greatest minds came not from universities, but from humble workshops and barns. These self-taught geniuses, engineers, blacksmiths, carpenters, turned their struggles into breakthroughs. Their names may not all be remembered, but their creations became the bones and muscles of the modern age. The Industrial Revolution belonged to them, the masters of metal, the architects of progress. By the early 19th century, invention had taken on an almost mythical quality. Engineers were now heroes, builders of wonders that defied imagination. The steam engine had evolved from a simple pump into a powerhouse of civilization. George Stephenson, known as the father of railways, built the first successful locomotive, the Rocket, in 1829. Its speed astonished crowds as it raced along the tracks of the Rainhill Trials, forever changing how humanity moved. Railways spread like veins of progress across Britain and the world. They connected distant towns, fueled commerce, and gave birth to modern logistics. Factories could now send goods hundreds of miles in days instead of weeks. The iron rails carried not just coal and cotton, but the dreams of a generation that believed no distance was too great to conquer. The railway symbolized movement of goods, of people, of ideas. Meanwhile, the iron industry reached new heights. With the introduction of Henry Cort's puddling process and later the Bessemer converter, iron became cheaper, stronger, and more versatile. Bridges, ships, and buildings that once seemed impossible began to rise. The famous Menai suspension bridge, built by Thomas Telford in 1826, stood as a testament to human ingenuity, a massive iron structure connecting land and water like a work of art. Engineers became the new artists, their canvas made of steel and stone. This was also the dawn of mechanization in nearly every field. Agricultural machines, like the mechanical reaper and threshing machine, transformed farming. Printing presses multiplied books faster than ever before, spreading knowledge and fueling literacy. In every sense, metal was becoming the flesh of modernity. The clanging of hammers and the hiss of steam were no longer just sounds. They were the music of a new civilization, bold and unstoppable. As machines reshaped cities and landscapes, another revolution unfolded quietly, a revolution of communication and connection. For the first time in history, human voices, ideas, and information began to travel faster than people themselves. The industrial age demanded coordination, and inventors delivered it. In 1837, Samuel Morse introduced the telegraph, a simple yet world-changing invention that could send coded messages across vast distances in seconds. The first telegraph lines connected London to distant ports, then stretched beneath oceans. When the first transatlantic cable linked Britain and America in 1858, it was as if the world had shrunk overnight. A message that once took weeks by ship could now travel in minutes. For the first time, humanity had built a nervous system for civilization, wires pulsing with electricity, binding continents together. At the same time, engineers were designing massive ships powered by steam. Ironclad vessels like the SS Great Britain, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, became symbols of industrial pride. Brunel's genius reshaped transport and architecture alike, from tunnels beneath rivers to the grand bridges that spanned them. His creations were both functional and majestic, representing the boundless confidence of an age that believed nothing was impossible. The impact of these inventions was deeper than anyone could imagine. They created the first global economy, allowing nations to trade instantly and industries to coordinate across oceans. They also changed how people saw themselves, no longer isolated by geography, but part of a connected world. The Industrial Revolution had begun as a series of mechanical innovations, but by the mid-19th century, it had evolved into something far greater, a network civilization built on speed, power, and imagination. Humanity had entered an age of iron and ideas, and the world would never again move at the pace of the horse. By the mid-19th century, Britain stood at the center of a global transformation. Its cities thundered with engines, its ports overflowed with goods, and its navy ruled the seas. The Industrial Revolution had turned a small island nation into the workshop of the world, a title earned not by chance, but by design. British coal fueled its steamships, British iron built its machines, and British textiles clothed millions across continents. From the cotton fields of India to the mines of Africa, the empire pulsed to the rhythm of British industry. Factories in Manchester and Birmingham worked day and night to produce goods for export: fabrics, tools, weapons, and machinery. In return, ships brought back raw materials from colonies: cotton, sugar, tea, rubber, and metals. This was not just trade. It was a carefully woven web of control. The empire provided the resources, and Britain supplied the technology. Together, they created a global economic engine that fed on both innovation and exploitation. But this prosperity came at a human cost. In India, the colonial textile industry was dismantled to make room for British imports, leaving local artisans jobless. In Africa and the Caribbean, enslaved or indentured laborers toiled on plantations producing the sugar and cotton that powered British factories. The wealth that filled London's banks was built on sweat and suffering an ocean away. Yet, at home, this empire of industry brought pride. The Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851 in London displayed Britain's industrial might to the world. Thousands of machines, inventions, and innovations under one glass roof. To many, it symbolized progress. To others, it was a reminder that power, once mechanical, could easily become imperial. The age of steam had not only built nations, it had built empires. Across the Atlantic, another giant was awakening. The United States, once a collection of rural states and frontier towns, began to transform into an industrial powerhouse of its own. The same steam engines that had revolutionized Britain now roared across American railroads and riverboats. The discovery of vast coal and iron deposits in Pennsylvania and Ohio provided the fuel for progress, while inventors like Eli Whitney, Samuel Colt, and Thomas Edison began shaping a uniquely American version of industrial innovation. By the mid-1800s, the United States was crisscrossed with railways that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 united the country physically and symbolically. Factories in the North produced steel, textiles, and machinery on a scale that rivaled Europe. Cities like New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago became centers of commerce and production. America's vast land, rich in resources, gave it a natural advantage that Britain could not match. Yet the American Industrial Revolution carried its own contradictions. While the North embraced factories and railroads, the South clung to slavery until the Civil War tore the nation apart. The same machines that powered progress also built weapons of destruction. After the war, however, industrialization accelerated rapidly. Immigrants from Europe filled the factories, and industrial tycoons, the so-called robber barons, rose to unimaginable wealth. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan symbolized both the ambition and excess of the era. By the late 19th century, the balance of power was shifting. America's steel mills outproduced Britain's. Its railways stretched farther. Its industries reached deeper into every corner of society. The world that Britain had built was now being inherited by a younger, hungrier nation. The Industrial Revolution had crossed oceans, and the New World was ready to lead. The Industrial Revolution, once confined to Britain's smoky cities, had become a worldwide phenomenon. The 19th century saw the rise of industrialization across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. In Germany, engineers and chemists created new industries in steel, chemicals, and electricity. Cities like Essen and Berlin became symbols of precision and power. The unification of Germany in 1871 gave rise to a nation that would soon challenge Britain's industrial supremacy. In France, modernization took a different path. The government invested in railways, textiles, and engineering, while Paris became a showcase of progress with its boulevards lit by gas lamps and later electricity. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Meiji Restoration of 1868 launched one of the most dramatic transformations in history. Determined to catch up with the West, Japan imported Western machines, technology, and experts. Within decades, it went from a feudal society to an industrial empire, proving that modernization was not the privilege of Europe alone. Industrialization also reshaped global trade routes. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, connected east and west like never before, allowing steamships to travel from London to Bombay in half the time. Telegraph cables crossed oceans, bringing instant communication to distant colonies and capitals. The world had never been more connected or more unequal. The wealth of the industrialized nations grew rapidly, while the rest of the world became suppliers of raw materials and consumers of finished goods. This new global web created opportunities and tensions alike. Empires competed fiercely for control of markets and resources, setting the stage for future conflicts. But it also birthed something extraordinary, a sense that humanity, for the first time, was moving together toward a shared modern age. The engines of progress had become engines of empire, and the Industrial Revolution had turned the planet into a single, pulsing machine of production and power. When the first puffing locomotives chugged along the British countryside, few realized they were witnessing the dawn of an era that would reshape time itself. The railway was more than an invention. It was a revolution in motion. Before it, travel was slow, uncertain, and ruled by nature, the speed of horses, the rhythm of wind, and the patience of rivers. With the arrival of George Stephenson's rocket in 1829, that world began to vanish. By the 1830s and 1840s, iron rails were spreading like veins across Britain's landscape. The Liverpool to Manchester Railway, the first major intercity line, connected factories, ports, and workers in a way never seen before. Coal and cotton could now travel hundreds of miles in a day, fueling the industrial machine with unprecedented efficiency. Towns that once slept quietly in rural isolation were suddenly roaring with the sound of locomotives. Their economies transformed overnight. Railways were not just an engineering triumph. They redefined human experience. For the first time, people could travel faster than the gallop of a horse. Journeys that once took days now took hours. The rhythm of life itself began to accelerate. Villages turned into towns, and towns into industrial cities. The train became a symbol of power, progress, and precision, the unstoppable heartbeat of modernity. The construction of railways demanded massive investments in labor. Thousands of navvies, workers, many of them Irish immigrants, toiled through mountains, tunnels, and swamps, often in brutal conditions. Yet the iron roads they laid down became the lifelines of the new industrial society. By mid-century, Britain's railway network stretched over 6,000 miles. Soon, the rail revolution crossed oceans to Europe, to America, and beyond, linking humanity in ways that no empire ever could. But it wasn't only goods and passengers that moved faster, it was ideas. The railways compressed distance, reshaped geography, and created the illusion that the world was suddenly smaller. This was the age when the world's horizons were no longer defined by how far one could walk, but by how fast one could ride. While iron rails conquered the land, the steamship conquered the seas. For centuries, the oceans had been ruled by wind. Unpredictable, dangerous, and slow. Sailors depended on the mercy of the weather. But when steam power met shipbuilding, humanity's mastery over the oceans took a giant leap forward. The SS Great Western, launched in 1838, became one of the first transatlantic steamships, crossing from Bristol to New York in just 15 days, a voyage that had once taken twice as long under sail. The SS Great Britain and later SS Great Eastern, designed by the engineering genius Isambard Kingdom Brunel, pushed the limits of maritime technology. Iron hulls replaced wooden ones, propellers replaced paddle wheels. These ships could carry hundreds of passengers and thousands of tons of cargo, moving raw materials from colonies to factories and finished goods back across the seas. Global trade boomed, and steam became the pulse of empire. With steamships, the oceans became highways. Mail could be delivered faster, soldiers deployed quicker, and goods transported more reliably. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 changed everything. No longer did ships have to sail around Africa. Now, they could steam straight from Europe to Asia through a narrow man-made passage. Travel time between London and Bombay was cut nearly in half, binding continents together under the mechanical rhythm of industry. Steamships didn't just move goods, they moved people. Millions of migrants crossed the Atlantic seeking new lives in the Americas. Others traveled to distant colonies, carrying with them technologies, cultures, and ambitions. The steam engine had turned migration into a global phenomenon. The movement of people, goods, and ideas accelerated beyond anything history had known. The world was no longer divided by vast, uncharted oceans. With steam power, humanity had bridged the seas. The age of exploration had given way to the age of connection. And for the first time, the planet itself felt within reach point. One of the most overlooked revolutions of this era was not made of iron or steam. It was made of time. Before the Industrial Revolution, time was local. Each town set its own clock according to the sun's position. Noon in London was not the same as noon in Manchester. That difference didn't matter when people traveled on foot or by horse. But when trains began running on strict timetables, chaos followed. Imagine, 2 trains scheduled to meet at a station, but each following a different local time. Accidents, confusion, and misconnections became common. The railways needed a solution, and they found it in standard time. In 1840, the Great Western Railway adopted Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, for all its schedules, synchronizing clocks across its network. Soon, other companies followed, and by the 1850s, railway time became the standard across Britain. This was more than a convenience. It was the synchronization of society itself. Factories, schools, post offices, and cities began aligning their clocks with the railways. For the first time, human life operated on a single, shared rhythm. In 1884, the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. established Greenwich as the world's prime meridian, dividing the globe into 24 time zones. Time had become global, standardized, measurable, industrial. The invention of the railway watch symbolized this new order. Workers and travelers carried time in their pockets, marking the minutes and seconds of industrial life. Every whistle, every departure, every factory bell followed the ticking of synchronized clocks. The machine age had not only changed how far people could go, it changed how they experienced every passing moment. By the late 19th century, the world was connected not just by rail and steam, but by time itself. Humanity had learned to measure, organize, and master its own existence with mechanical precision. The Industrial Revolution had conquered the landscape, the oceans, and finally, time. The world had become faster, smaller, and astonishingly modern. Behind the roar of steam and the glow of progress, the heart of the Industrial Revolution was human. Millions of men, women, and children who powered the machines with their hands, sweat, and lives. As factories multiplied across Britain and Europe, workers flooded from rural villages to industrial towns, seeking wages and stability. But what they found was often misery disguised as opportunity. Factory life was harsh beyond imagination. A typical day stretched from sunrise to sunset, 12 to 16 hours, 6 days a week. In the cotton mills of Manchester or the ironworks of Birmingham, the air was thick with dust, heat, and danger. Accidents were common. Fingers crushed in gears, limbs torn by spinning shafts, lungs blackened by soot. There were no safety laws, no unions, and no compensation. If a worker was injured, he was simply replaced. Children were not spared. Factory owners valued their small hands for cleaning machinery or operating looms. Many started working at the age of 6 or 7, earning a few pennies a week. They worked in conditions that would horrify any modern observer, crawling beneath moving machines, inhaling fibers, enduring beatings for mistakes. Charles Dickens captured this grim reality in his novels, turning industrial England's poor into symbols of both suffering and endurance. Women, too, became a crucial part of the workforce. While men dominated the mines and foundries, women worked long hours in textile factories or as domestic servants, earning far less than their male counterparts. The dual burden of labor and home crushed many. Yet within these struggles, the seeds of social change began to sprout. The industrial worker, once invisible, was awakening to his own strength, realizing that without him, the machines would fall silent. This awakening was not just about wages or hours. It was about identity. The Industrial Revolution had created a new social class, the working class, bound not by land or title, but by labor. They were the builders of a new world, yet the last to share its benefits. And soon, they would demand to be heard. As the smoke of industry darkened the skies, so too grew the unrest beneath it. Workers crushed by endless toil and poverty began to organize. Their voices rose from the factories, the mines, and the streets, a chorus demanding fairness in an age of greed. The earliest protests were small and desperate. In the 1810s and 1820s, groups like the Luddites emerged, skilled artisans who smashed machines they believed had stolen their livelihoods. Though often misunderstood, their rebellion was less about destroying progress and more about fighting for dignity in a world that treated them as expendable parts. Their resistance was crushed, but their anger echoed across decades. By the mid-19th century, more organized movements began to rise. The Chartist movement in Britain demanded political rights for workers, universal male suffrage, fair representation, and secret ballots. Though their petitions were rejected, their spirit transformed the public conscience. They made one thing clear: industrial laborers were not mere hands for hire, but citizens with voices. Labor unions began to form, slowly and secretly at first, as joining them could lead to imprisonment or blacklisting. Yet their persistence paid off. By the 1850s and 1860s, unions became powerful enough to negotiate wages and conditions. Strikes, once viewed as rebellion, became tools of justice. In cities like Manchester, Glasgow, and London, workers began gathering in halls and parks, discussing not only their pay but the kind of society they wanted to build. Intellectuals and reformers joined their cause. Figures like Robert Owen, a visionary industrialist, built model communities where workers had better homes, education, and fair treatment. His experiments at New Lanark in Scotland inspired others to imagine a more humane capitalism. Meanwhile, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, observing the same grim factories, penned the Communist Manifesto in 1848, arguing that industrial society was a battlefield between classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. For the first time in history, workers were not just victims. They were becoming a movement. Their unity, forged in hardship, began to challenge the moral foundation of the industrial world. The age of silent labor was ending. The age of organized resistance had begun. The cries for justice could not be ignored forever. As the 19th century progressed, the tide began to turn, slowly, unevenly, but irreversibly. Reformers, writers, and politicians started confronting the dark side of progress. The same industrial wealth that built palaces also filled slums. Disease spread through overcrowded neighborhoods. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis became constant killers. The gap between rich and poor widened like a wound on civilization's face. In response, governments began to act. Britain's Factory Acts, starting in 1833, limited child labor and set the first standards for working hours. The Mines Act of 1842 banned women and children from underground work. Later, the 10 Hours Act of 1847 restricted women and young people to a 10-hour workday. A small victory, but a symbolic one. The idea that the state had a duty to protect its citizens, not just its profits, was taking root. Education became another battleground. Reformers believed ignorance was the chain that kept workers powerless. By the 1870s, public education laws spread across Europe, ensuring that even the poorest children could read, write, and dream of a better life. Literacy gave workers new weapons, knowledge and awareness. Newspapers, pamphlets, and books carried revolutionary ideas far and wide, sparking debates in pubs, schools, and homes. Yet, change did not come peacefully everywhere. In France, the revolutions of 1848 erupted in the name of liberty and equality. Across Europe, barricades rose and monarchies trembled. Though many of these uprisings failed, they sent a message that would echo into the 20th century. The people had found their voice, and they would not surrender it again. By the end of the 19th century, labor reforms had reshaped modern society. The concept of weekends, limits on child labor, and the recognition of workers' unions became part of the social fabric. The working class had fought not only for bread and wages, but for respect and rights. The Industrial Revolution had created vast wealth, but it also birthed conscience. Out of soot and suffering rose a new kind of power, not mechanical, but moral. The world was learning that progress measured in machines was hollow unless matched by progress in humanity. The Industrial Revolution was more than an economic shift. It was a revolution of imagination. Behind every machine that thundered in the factories, there stood a thinker, a dreamer, an innovator who dared to ask, what if? Their creations rewrote the rules of civilization. It began with men like James Watt, whose improvements to the steam engine in the 1760s gave humanity a new kind of power, one not bound by wind, or muscle. Watt's idea of condensing steam separately from the piston transformed an inefficient machine into the beating heart of industry. His partnership with entrepreneur Matthew Boulton made his engine a commercial success, fueling factories, mines, and ships across the world. Then came Richard Arkwright, the barber-turned-inventor who mechanized textile production. His water frame spun thread stronger and faster than any human hand. With it, he built the first modern factory in Cromford, an organized system of machines, labor, and discipline that defined industrial capitalism itself. In those walls, the concept of the workplace as we know it was born. Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793 revolutionized agriculture, separating cotton fibers from seeds at lightning speed. It fed Britain's textile mills and expanded America's plantation economy, a double-edged invention that enriched industry but deepened slavery. Meanwhile, George Stephenson's locomotive and Robert Fulton's steamboat turned mobility into mastery, shrinking nations and binding them together through rails and rivers. Every generation of inventors built upon the last. The 19th century witnessed an explosion of creativity, from Michael Faraday's discovery of electromagnetic induction to Charles Babbage's vision of a mechanical computer. Even Ada Lovelace, often called the world's first programmer, imagined a future where machines could compose music or solve equations. The Industrial Revolution had evolved beyond engines. It had become an era of intellectual fire. Each invention, whether humble or grand, carried the same truth. Knowledge was power, and that power was spreading faster than steam. AS machines reshaped cities, science reshaped thought. The Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution became twin forces, one transforming matter, the other transforming understanding. The world was no longer guided by mystery or superstition, but by discovery, experiment, and evidence. The 18th and 19th centuries birthed a generation of scientists whose discoveries not only advanced technology, but redefined humanity's place in the universe. Isaac Newton's laws of motion had already given engineers the mathematical language to harness mechanics, but new questions demanded new minds. Michael Faraday, a self-taught genius from a poor background, unlocked the relationship between electricity and magnetism. His experiments with coils and magnets would later give birth to electric motors, generators, and the entire field of electromagnetism, a discovery as monumental as fire itself. Then came James Clerk Maxwell, whose equations united electricity, magnetism, and light into a single theory. His work became the foundation of modern physics, influencing everything from radio waves to quantum theory. Meanwhile, Humphrey Davy and his assistant Faraday discovered elements and developed chemical innovations that improved lighting, metallurgy, and medicine. The study of chemistry itself became industrial. Louis Pasteur's germ theory revolutionized health and sanitation, saving millions from diseases once thought to be curses. Joseph Lister's antiseptic techniques transformed surgery from a desperate gamble into a science of healing. Even food preservation, with Nicholas Appert's invention of canning, was a direct child of industrial science. Science also began to question humanity's origins. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, proposing evolution by natural selection. It was a theory as radical as the steam engine, one that shifted how humanity saw itself. Progress was no longer just mechanical. It was biological, intellectual, and eternal. The laboratory had become as important as the factory. The scientist was now as powerful as the industrialist. Together, they forged a partnership that would define the modern age, one where curiosity was the new currency of progress. While steam and coal powered the early 19th century, a new invisible force began to take over: electricity. It was unseen, silent, and mysterious, yet would soon power the lamps of cities and the hearts of machines. The electric age dawned quietly, with wires stretching across laboratories and later across continents. Samuel Morse's telegraph in 1837 changed communication forever. For the first time in history, messages could travel faster than people. The famous line, "What hath God wrought?" sent in 1844, marked the beginning of instant communication. The world suddenly shrank. Business, diplomacy, and even love letters could now cross oceans in minutes instead of months. By the 1860s, telegraph cables linked Europe and America beneath the Atlantic, weaving the first global web of information. Then came Thomas Edison, whose laboratories in Menlo Park became factories of invention. In 1879, he perfected the incandescent light bulb, bringing illumination to homes and streets. Darkness, once the natural boundary of human activity, was conquered. Cities glowed, factories ran through the night, and time itself lost its limits. Edison's inventions, from the phonograph to the motion picture, turned electricity into experience, industry into culture. Nikola Tesla, a visionary genius, took the electric revolution further. His alternating current, AC, system allowed power to travel long distances safely and efficiently, lighting up entire nations. The war of currents between Tesla and Edison defined the new frontier of innovation, but Tesla's ideas ultimately prevailed, laying the foundation for the modern power grid. Electricity also sparked new forms of creativity. Engineers, inventors, and dreamers began to imagine what else might be possible. Could sound and images travel through air? Could machines think? Could light itself be used for communication? These questions, born in the 19th century, would become the driving forces of the 20th. The Industrial Revolution had started with fire and iron, but now it glowed with light and logic. Humanity had discovered how to harness nature's most elusive forces. The age of electricity was not just another step forward. It was the moment when progress became limitless. The Industrial Revolution did more than mechanize labor. It reshaped the very landscapes of civilization. Small villages, once quiet and self-contained, transformed almost overnight into sprawling, chaotic urban centers. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and Leeds became the epicenters of industry, pulsing with energy, smoke, and ambition. This was urbanization at an unprecedented scale, where the countryside surrendered its populations to the roar of machines and the promise of wages. Between 1750 and 1850, Britain's population more than doubled, and much of that growth was concentrated in industrial towns. Families moved to cities not out of desire, but necessity. The rural economy could no longer sustain them. The promise of factories, however harsh, offered food, work, and, above all, survival. Streets filled with newly arrived laborers, many living in squalid tenements with no sanitation. Wells and rivers were contaminated. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded neighborhoods. Despite these hardships, the cities thrived as centers of trade, innovation, and commerce. Architecture adapted to this new urban reality. Rows of brick terraced houses sprouted near factories, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Narrow alleys and tight courtyards maximized space, but provided little light or air. The skyline itself transformed. Chimneys replaced church steeples. Smoke hung permanently in the air, and the sound of machinery drowned out the pastoral quiet of the past. Urban planning was in its infancy, and few imagined the problems that would come with such explosive growth. Yet in the midst of filth and noise, the Industrial Revolution forged a new kind of society, one where labor, production, and industry were inseparable from the very spaces people lived in. The human cost was immense. Families crammed into single rooms. Children worked alongside their parents in factories. Life expectancy in industrial districts fell far below rural averages. Still, the allure of cities was irresistible. They were magnets for opportunity, culture, and education. Industrial cities were both prisons and arenas, places where human endurance, creativity, and ambition were tested to their limits. The Industrial Revolution not only built new cities, but redefined architecture itself. Iron, steel, and glass became the materials of progress. Traditional masonry and timber construction could not support the massive factories, warehouses, and train stations that the new age demanded. Engineers and architects embraced innovation, creating structures that were both functional and monumental. Factories became cathedrals of industry. Inside, vast open spaces housed rows of machines and workers, lit by skylights or, later, electric lamps. The architecture emphasized efficiency, tall ceilings for ventilation, wide windows for light, and iron framework strong enough to support enormous machinery. The textile mills of Manchester exemplified this approach, blending durability with productivity. These buildings were more than workplaces. They were symbols of power, authority, and modernity. Public architecture also evolved. The rise of railways necessitated grand stations, such as Street Pancras in London or Gare du Nord in Paris, which combined engineering prowess with aesthetic elegance. Cast iron bridges spanned rivers, while suspension bridges connected previously isolated regions. Factories, warehouses, and stations transformed the cityscape into an industrial metropolis, creating an environment that celebrated progress and efficiency over tradition. Yet, the same structures that symbolized advancement also highlighted inequality. Opulent office buildings for owners and managers stood mere blocks from workers' tenements. Public spaces were scarce, and urban planning lagged behind population growth. The contrast between wealth and poverty was etched into the very stones and iron of these cities. In this tension between power and labor, ambition and survival, the industrial metropolis became a stage on which the drama of modern society would unfold. The Industrial Revolution had not only mechanized production, but reshaped the very form of human civilization. Life in industrial cities was a sensory overload. Streets were alive with the clatter of carts, the whistle of steam engines, and the chatter of laborers. Markets overflowed with goods, factories belched smoke, and railways connected neighborhoods in a ceaseless rhythm. For residents, each day was dictated by the clock, factory bells, train whistles, and shop openings. Time itself became regimented, a commodity measured as precisely as coal or cotton. The working class endured extreme hardship, but communities formed around shared struggles. Taverns, markets, and churches became spaces of solidarity. Families squeezed into cramped apartments, children played in alleys, and neighbors looked after one another despite harsh conditions. Yet the shadow of disease loomed. Cholera epidemics swept through slums, and poor sanitation made mortality rates grim. For every story of survival, countless lives were lost to industrialization's harsh demands. Urban culture also flourished in unexpected ways. Theaters, music halls, and libraries offered respite from factory toil. Newspapers spread ideas, labor movements, and political awareness. Workers found not only ways to endure, but ways to dream. Education, philanthropy, and reform efforts gradually began to improve conditions. But change was slow and uneven. Cities became the crucibles of modern society, places where technology, labor, social inequality, and human ambition collided in relentless, transformative energy. By the late 19th century, industrial cities had created a new reality. Humanity had learned to live, work, and even thrive in environments dominated by machines, smoke, and iron. Urbanization was no longer a temporary phenomenon. It was the hallmark of modern civilization. The Industrial Revolution had built these giants of stone and steel, and in doing so, it had reshaped the very rhythm of human life, forever linking labor, architecture, and innovation in the pulse of the city. The Industrial Revolution did more than transform industry. It transformed the very fabric of the economy. For centuries, wealth had been tied to land, titles, or agriculture. But the factories, steam engines, and mechanized production of the 18th and 19th centuries shifted power toward those who controlled capital. In this new economy, money, machinery, and labor became the engines of wealth, giving rise to a class of industrialists who were powerful, ambitious, and often ruthless. Entrepreneurs like Richard Arkwright, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller turned factories and mills into empires. They understood that profit depended on efficiency, scale, and innovation. The textile barons of Manchester could produce more cloth in a day than whole villages had woven in a year. Steel tycoons in Pittsburgh and London built railways, bridges, and ships that enabled unprecedented commerce. Wealth was no longer inherited. It was earned through vision, risk, and often the relentless exploitation of labor. At the heart of this system was capitalism, a philosophy as powerful as any machine. The economy operated on supply and demand, investment and profit, competition and innovation. Banks and stock markets provided the financial infrastructure to fuel growth. Entrepreneurs borrowed, invested, speculated, and reinvested, creating an economic cycle that expanded production, trade, and technological advancement at unprecedented speed. Yet with vast wealth came stark inequality. The same economy that built factories and railways left workers in squalid conditions. While owners lived in grand townhouses and dined on imported luxuries, laborers crowded into tenements, surviving on meager wages. Child labor was rampant, and safety regulations were almost non-existent. The Industrial Revolution created abundance, but it also magnified poverty, laying the foundations for a new social struggle. The emerging economic order was powerful and transformative, but it demanded a society willing to pay the price for progress. The same steam and steel that fueled wealth for the few often imprisoned the many in cycles of deprivation. Urban laborers faced punishing schedules, 12 to 16-hour workdays, 6 days a week. Children as young as 6 worked in factories, mines, and workshops, while women often earned half the wages of men for the same work. Housing was cramped and unsanitary. Disease spread through alleys and tenements like wildfire. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis were constant threats. Industrial progress had come, but human well-being lagged behind. Workers began to see that economic growth alone could not guarantee a better life. Social reformers and thinkers highlighted the human cost. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels documented the struggles of the proletariat in the Communist Manifesto, arguing that capitalism was inherently exploitative, pitting labor against capital in a struggle that could only end with revolution or reform. In Britain, the Factory Acts began to regulate working hours, limit child labor, and establish basic protections, though enforcement was often weak. Economic inequality also affected education, health, and opportunity. The children of factory workers were far less likely to receive schooling or escape poverty. Rural laborers who had moved to cities often found themselves trapped in a rigid system of work and survival. Public health measures lagged, and social mobility was limited. Yet these struggles sparked new consciousness. Workers began to form unions, advocate for political representation, and demand reforms that would protect their lives and livelihoods. The era revealed a paradox. Industrialization could create enormous wealth for society, but also immense suffering for individuals. In the factories, the streets, and the mines, the consequences of economic growth were visible, visceral, and often tragic. The Industrial Revolution had not only built machines, it had built stark contrast between riches and destitution, privilege and poverty, hope and despair. Faced with these inequalities, the working class began to organize, forming the foundations of modern labor movements. Strikes, protests, and petitions emerged as ordinary workers demanded fair wages, safer conditions, and reasonable working hours. While early efforts were often suppressed violently, persistence gradually reshaped the social contract. Trade unions became increasingly influential by the late 19th century. Groups like the Amalgamated Society of Engineers in Britain secured better pay and working hours through collective action. Governments, recognizing the growing political power of the working class, enacted reforms to prevent unrest. Compulsory education, labor protections, minimum wages, and health regulations slowly improved lives, demonstrating that society could balance industrial growth with human rights. Industrialists themselves sometimes embraced reform. Figures like Robert Owen in Scotland pioneered model communities for workers, offering housing, schools, and fair labor conditions. These experiments, though limited in scale, showed that industry could coexist with human dignity. Other reformers, like Lord Shaftesbury, championed child labor laws, factory inspections, and social welfare, creating a blueprint for a society in which labor was protected from exploitation. By the early 20th century, capitalism had matured into a system that recognized both profit and social responsibility, though tensions remained. Wealth continued to accumulate, but labor had a voice. Workers had gained legal protections, unions had negotiated power, and society had begun to see the Industrial Revolution not merely as an engine of machines, but as a platform for human progress. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the economy, reshaping social hierarchies and redefining the relationship between wealth and human dignity. Capitalism had unleashed unprecedented prosperity, and at the same time, sparked the consciousness that progress must be shared. The stage was set for the modern world. Industrial, urban, unequal, yet striving for balance, fairness, and reform. The rise of industrial cities brought more than factories, railways, and wealth. It brought disease. The densely packed urban centers of Britain, Europe, and later America became breeding grounds for illness. Streets were narrow, tenements crowded, and sanitation virtually non-existent. Human waste was dumped into rivers that also served as drinking water, creating a perfect environment for epidemics. Cholera, typhus, smallpox, and tuberculosis ravaged populations. Outbreaks swept through industrial cities repeatedly, claiming tens of thousands of lives. In London, the 1832 cholera epidemic killed over 6,000 people, shocking society into awareness of the dangers posed by unplanned urban growth. In Manchester, Glasgow, and Birmingham, infant mortality rates soared, often reaching 30 to 50% in working-class districts. Life in industrial cities was a daily struggle for survival, and even minor illnesses could become fatal. doctors and scientists began to investigate the causes of these epidemics. Initially, miasma theory, the belief that bad air caused disease, dominated medical thought. Physicians urged urban improvements, such as wider streets and better ventilation, which did improve health indirectly. Yet the real culprits, bacteria, contaminated water, and poor hygiene, remained hidden until the advent of germ theory. Pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch would later provide the scientific understanding necessary to combat these illnesses effectively. The human cost of industrialization was stark. Workers lived next to the factories that employed them. Children played in polluted streets. Families slept in cramped, damp apartments. Disease was not only a personal tragedy, but a social crisis, undermining productivity and contributing to social unrest. Public health, once a matter of individual responsibility, became a collective necessity, demanding societal, technological, and governmental intervention. As mortality and suffering mounted, reformers and engineers recognized that industrialization demanded a new approach to urban living. Sanitation became a science, and cities began to invest in infrastructure that could save lives as well as facilitate growth. One of the most transformative innovations was the development of modern sewer systems. In London, the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so polluted that the summer heat intensified its stench, forced authorities to act. Joseph Bazalgette, a brilliant civil engineer, designed a network of underground sewers capable of draining waste away from the city, drastically reducing cholera outbreaks and setting a global standard for urban sanitation. Clean water supplies were equally critical. Cities built reservoirs, aqueducts, and filtration systems to deliver potable water to urban populations. Public fountains, pumps, and later indoor plumbing slowly replaced contaminated wells and rivers. These measures were life-saving, reducing mortality and improving the general health of urban populations. Health reform also extended beyond infrastructure. Governments and philanthropists began to advocate for better housing, nutrition, and workplace hygiene. Organizations like the Health of Towns Association in Britain and similar movements across Europe promoted inspection of factories and tenements. Urban planning emerged as a field in response to industrial challenges, with wider streets, parks, and regulated building codes aimed at preventing overcrowding and disease. Education became part of public health. Schools taught hygiene. Vaccination campaigns fought smallpox, and public awareness campaigns encouraged better personal and community practices. The combination of engineering, medicine, and social reform slowly transformed industrial cities from death traps into livable, organized urban centers. Industrialization had forced society to confront the intimate link between environment, health, and survival, a lesson that would shape public policy for generations. Health crises also transformed society. Workers recognized that their well-being was integral not just to survival, but to productivity and dignity. Labor movements began to link sanitary conditions, working hours, and factory safety with broader social rights. Strikes and protests often demanded more than wages. They demanded clean workplaces, safe housing, and attention to public health. Public hospitals and clinics emerged to address industrial injuries and epidemic outbreaks. Philanthropists, reformers, and governments collaborated to create institutions capable of treating the sick and preventing disease. Florence Nightingale, whose work in nursing and sanitation gained fame during the Crimean War, applied similar principles in civilian hospitals, emphasizing cleanliness, ventilation, and systematic care. Her work inspired health reforms in cities where industrial accidents and disease were rampant. Industrialization's health challenges also highlighted class divisions. Wealthier citizens could afford private water, better housing, and medical care, while the working poor were forced into crowded, disease-prone conditions. Public health reform became a mechanism for social justice, bridging the gap between technological progress and human welfare. Societies learned that industrial growth could not be sustainable unless it was accompanied by attention to life itself. By the late 19th century, the combined impact of engineering, medical science, and social reform had begun to tame the health crises of industrial cities. Mortality rates declined, children survived at higher rates, and urban life became manageable for more people. The Industrial Revolution had forced humanity to confront the limits of survival in a mechanized world. And in doing so, it laid the foundations for modern public health, sanitation, and social responsibility. Civilization had learned that the pursuit of progress must always walk hand in hand with the protection of life. The Industrial Revolution had begun to reshape not just production, but the very geography of human experience. Railways became the arteries of the industrial world, connecting factories, markets, and people across vast distances. Before their arrival, travel and trade were slow, unreliable, and dictated by the limits of horses, rivers, and carts. The steam locomotive changed everything, collapsing distances and accelerating the pace of life. In Britain, the Liverpool to Manchester Railway, completed in 1830, became the blueprint for a global network. Trains could transport coal, cotton, and manufactured goods hundreds of miles in a single day. Railways opened up new economic possibilities, making previously isolated towns centers of industry and commerce. The scale of construction was staggering. Tracks had to cross mountains, rivers, and swamps. Tens of thousands of laborers, known as navvies, worked under grueling conditions, digging tunnels and laying iron rails with primitive tools. The impact on society was equally profound. Railways standardized time, forced punctuality, and created an unprecedented sense of national and even global connectivity. Towns and cities expanded along the rail lines. People traveled more freely for work, leisure, and migration. Industrialization had given rise to a new social rhythm, dictated by the ceaseless pulse of locomotives. It was as if the planet itself had contracted and the boundaries of human experience had been redrawn by iron rails. Railways also carried ideas, culture, and conflict. News spread faster, newspapers circulated widely, and political movements gained traction across regions. The locomotive became a symbol of progress, mobility, and power. By the late 19th century, countries like the United States, Germany, and Russia were building continental railway networks, each stretch of track further shrinking the world and knitting it into a unified, mechanized whole. While railways conquered land, steamships conquered the oceans. Humanity, once at the mercy of wind and weather, could now cross seas and oceans on schedule. The SS Great Western and SS Great Britain demonstrated that regular, reliable transatlantic travel was possible. Cargoes of raw materials and manufactured goods traversed the globe with efficiency previously unimaginable. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 accelerated global trade. Ships could travel from Europe to Asia in half the time, bypassing months-long journeys around Africa. This transformed commerce, diplomacy, and migration. Ports became bustling hubs of industry and culture, and the world economy became deeply interconnected. Colonies were more efficiently supplied and exploited. Global markets for British textiles, Indian cotton, and Caribbean sugar expanded exponentially. Steamships also facilitated human migration on a massive scale. Millions left Europe for the Americas in search of opportunity. and others traveled to colonies for work or settlement. The movement of people mirrored the movement of goods, creating new social dynamics and cultural exchanges. This was an age when the world became physically smaller and socially more complex. Nations were no longer isolated. They were linked by iron, coal, and steam. With this global connectivity came both opportunity and tension. Trade disputes, colonial rivalries, and migration crises emerged as nations grappled with newfound interdependence. Yet for most people, steamships represented possibility, the chance to travel, trade, and communicate faster than ever before. Industrialization had not only mechanized production, it had transformed the very concept of distance. If railways and steamships shrank the world physically, the telegraph shrank it intellectually. Samuel Morse's invention in the 1830s allowed messages to travel faster than human carriers, bridging vast distances in minutes rather than weeks. Telegraph lines soon stretched across continents and oceans, creating the first truly global communication network. Business transactions, government orders, and personal messages could now cross the planet almost instantaneously. The telegraph transformed commerce, diplomacy, and warfare. Stock markets reacted to news in real time. Governments coordinated policy across empires. Military commanders could issue orders to distant outposts. Newspapers transmitted information across continents, spreading ideas and shaping public opinion. The telegraph became the nervous system of the industrial age, connecting people, institutions, and nations. By the late 19th century, the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell further accelerated communication. Unlike the telegraph, the telephone allowed real-time, personal conversation across long distances. Suddenly, individuals could speak directly to one another regardless of location, shrinking the psychological as well as the physical world. Later innovations, including wireless telegraphy, would extend these connections further, laying the groundwork for the globalized communication networks we know today. Transportation and communication technologies did more than move goods and messages. They reshaped human relationships, economics, and culture. Travel, trade, and ideas now flowed across the planet at unprecedented speed. By the turn of the 20th century, humanity had built a network of rails, steam, and electrical signals that bound the world together, making it smaller, faster, and more interconnected than ever before. Industrialization had not only powered machines, it had transformed the very scale of human experience. Industrialization demanded more than labor, it demanded knowledge. Factories, railways, and mines required trained workers, clerks, and engineers. This created a powerful incentive for literacy and education, which had previously been the privilege of the wealthy or clergy. The rapidly expanding industrial society relied on a population that could read, write, and perform basic arithmetic to operate machinery, maintain accounts, and follow complex procedures. Schools became a central instrument of social transformation. In Britain, the Factory Acts and later educational legislation gradually made primary education compulsory for children. By the late 19th century, literacy rates were rising dramatically. Similar trends appeared across Europe and the United States, where urban populations recognized that knowledge was as important as muscle. Education became a social equalizer, a path, however narrow, out of poverty. Printing technology also flourished alongside industrialization. Newspapers, pamphlets, and books became widely available. The rise of periodicals allowed the spread of political ideas, scientific knowledge, and social critique. Figures like Charles Dickens used literature to highlight the plight of the working class, while scientific journals shared breakthroughs in medicine, chemistry, and engineering. The Industrial Revolution created a new kind of citizen, one who could read, think, and act in a complex society. For the working class, education became a form of empowerment. Literacy allowed workers to organize, communicate, and advocate for rights. Schools were not just places of learning. They were incubators of social awareness, political consciousness, and personal aspiration. Industrialization had created not only factories, but also a society that demanded thinkers as much as laborers. Education in the Industrial Revolution went beyond basic literacy. Technical knowledge and scientific understanding became essential to the functioning of the industrial society. Engineering schools, technical colleges, and apprenticeships trained workers, managers, and inventors to operate and improve machines. The proliferation of such institutions reflected the growing recognition that knowledge itself was a resource, a capital as valuable as coal or steel. Institutions like the École Polytechnique in France and the Mechanics Institutes in Britain disseminated scientific and technical knowledge to middle-class and working-class populations. Workshops, lectures, and hands-on training provided a practical understanding of mechanics, chemistry, and physics. Students learned to calculate stresses in iron beams, understand the thermodynamics of steam engines, and innovate in textile or mining machinery. Scientific societies and professional networks flourished. The Royal Society of London and similar organizations in Europe became hubs for exchanging knowledge. Journals circulated discoveries rapidly, bridging the gap between theoretical science and industrial application. The Industrial Revolution was not simply a mechanical revolution. It was a revolution of applied knowledge. Each technological leap, from the spinning jenny to the electric motor, depended on educated minds capable of experimentation, calculation, and observation. The spread of scientific knowledge also fostered social mobility. Workers who demonstrated skill and understanding could rise to supervisory positions, become engineers, or even inventors. Education became a bridge between the laboring masses and industrial elites, creating a meritocratic thread in an otherwise hierarchical society. Industrialization demanded learning, and in response, society created the mechanisms to provide it: schools, apprenticeships, and societies that democratized knowledge. Industrialization not only demanded knowledge, but also facilitated its widespread distribution. Cities teemed with libraries, reading rooms, and educational societies. Public libraries, funded by philanthropists and local governments, provided access to books and periodicals for people of all social classes. Literacy became a tool not only for employment, but for intellectual freedom, self-improvement, and civic engagement. Newspapers and periodicals flourished in the 19th century. Advances in printing technology, paper production, and distribution enabled the mass circulation of daily news, serialized novels, and political commentary. Citizens could now engage with local, national, and even global events. Social movements, political debates, and labor activism were amplified by these channels, allowing ideas to travel faster than ever before. Information became a form of social power. Education and knowledge also transformed cultural life. Scientific lectures, exhibitions, and public demonstrations popularized new discoveries. The Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, with its displays of machinery, inventions, and raw materials, became a spectacle of both industrial achievement and educational opportunity. Visitors absorbed information, marveled at innovations, and imagined new possibilities. Education became not just instruction, but inspiration. fueling further invention and progress. By the end of the 19th century, literacy and knowledge had become fundamental pillars of industrial society. Industrialization had mechanized production, but it had also mechanized learning, communication, and intellectual growth. The educated population became a crucial engine of the modern world, capable of innovation, reform, and participation in a rapidly changing society. Industrial progress had transformed human thought, creating not just factories and cities, but informed, connected, and empowered citizens ready to shape the future. The Industrial Revolution had given humanity unprecedented technological power, but it had also created social upheaval. Workers toiled long hours in dangerous factories, mines, and workshops, often for meager wages. Families lived crammed into unsanitary tenements, with disease, hunger, and child labor as constant companions. In these conditions, a new consciousness began to emerge, a recognition that labor, effort, and skill were the foundations of society. Yet workers were denied dignity, fairness, and protection. The early labor movements were born from this awareness. They were not monolithic or coordinated at first. Small groups of artisans, weavers, and miners protested, petitioned, and occasionally struck, demanding better conditions or fair pay. The Luddites of the 1810s, often portrayed as mere machine breakers, were actually skilled workers fighting for survival against mechanization that threatened their livelihoods. While their methods were sometimes destructive, their grievances highlighted the human cost of progress and sparked wider debate about the morality of industrialization. Throughout Europe and North America, the working class slowly organized. In Britain, the Chartist movement of the 1830s and 1840s demanded political reform, universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and representation for working class citizens. Although the movement did not immediately achieve its goals, it set a precedent. Workers could mobilize collectively to challenge social and political structures. Across the Atlantic, unions and worker associations began forming in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, pushing back against corporate and industrial exploitation. Industrialization had created vast wealth, but the growing gap between rich and poor forced a reckoning. The labor movement emerged as a moral and political response, asserting that progress was meaningless if human life, dignity, and rights were sacrificed at the altar of profit. By the mid-19th century, labor movements had evolved from scattered protests into organized entities capable of negotiating for systemic change. Trade unions became the primary vehicles for collective bargaining, representing workers in various trades from engineering to textiles. Membership often carried risk. Many governments and employers considered unions illegal or subversive. Yet the persistence of workers led to gradual recognition and legal protection. Strikes became powerful tools. The Amalgamated Society of Engineers in Britain, established in 1851, exemplified the rise of industrial unions. Through strikes and negotiations, they secured better wages, reduced hours, and improved working conditions. Across Europe, similar organizations arose, advocating for labor rights, including limitations on child labor, safer working environments, and the right to organize without retaliation. Legal reform was intertwined with these movements. Governments gradually recognized that unregulated labor led to social unrest, public health crises, and economic inefficiency. The Factory Acts in Britain, beginning in 1833, limited working hours for children and later extended protections to women. Laws regulating mine safety, factory inspection, and minimum wages followed in subsequent decades. These reforms were often incremental, contested, and unevenly enforced, but they established the principle that the state had a responsibility to protect workers. Labor movements also had profound cultural and social effects. They fostered solidarity, collective identity, and political consciousness among workers. Meetings, pamphlets, and newspapers spread ideas, creating networks of communication and coordination. Industrial workers became not just producers of goods, but citizens aware of their collective power. The struggle for labor rights became inseparable from the broader struggle for democracy, social justice, and equality in industrial society. Industrialization's human cost prompted not only labor organization, but broader social reform. Philanthropists, reformers, and enlightened industrialists began experimenting with ways to humanize work and urban life. Robert Owen's new Lanark mills in Scotland exemplified this approach. He provided schools, housing, and fair wages for workers, demonstrating that productivity and morality could coexist. Though rare, these experiments influenced the development of social policy across Europe. Public health reforms intertwined with labor reform. Campaigns for sanitation, clean water, ventilation, and housing improvements were often championed by labor activists and social reformers alike. Governments eventually enacted regulations addressing child labor, working hours, and factory safety. Education became another key focus, ensuring that future generations could rise above industrial oppression through literacy and knowledge. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the combination of union activism, legislation, and social reform had reshaped industrial society. Workers gained the right to organize, limits on working hours were enforced, child labor declined, and basic public health measures improved living conditions. Industrialization had generated both unprecedented wealth and profound social challenges. But through struggle and advocacy, the working class claimed its place as a vital participant in shaping modern civilization. The Industrial Revolution was therefore not just a story of machines and innovation. It was also a story of humanity asserting its rights, dignity, and capacity for self-determination. Without the efforts of workers, reformers, and activists, the industrial age might have been remembered only for exploitation and suffering. Instead, it became a period of transformation, struggle, and progress that laid the groundwork for the social and economic systems of the modern world. The Industrial Revolution transformed the workplace, and women were at its heart. Before industrialization, women's labor was primarily domestic, agricultural, or artisanal, largely invisible to the wider economy. Factories changed that, creating new opportunities but also exposing women to the harsh realities of industrial life. Textile mills, garment workshops, and domestic industries employed thousands of women, often in grueling conditions. In Britain, textile towns like Manchester and Leeds were dominated by female labor. Women operated spinning jennies, power looms, and other machinery, sometimes for wages far lower than men. In the United States, young women moved from rural farms to northern factories, earning independence yet enduring long hours, dangerous machinery, and strict supervision. Work could last 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Injuries were common, and regulations were minimal. Despite the hardship, industrial work gave women a new form of visibility and economic agency. They contributed to household income, gained skills, and experienced life beyond the home. Many women sent remittances to support families, demonstrating their critical economic role. Yet industrial society valued their labor primarily for its cheapness. The pay gap was immense, and their labor was often exploited to maximize profit. Industrialization created both opportunity and vulnerability, challenging traditional gender roles while also reinforcing social inequalities. The presence of women in factories also reshaped urban society. Female workers lived in boarding houses or crowded neighborhoods, forming communities that shared experiences, struggles, and solidarity. They began to organize, not yet in full political terms, but through mutual aid societies, strikes, and advocacy. These early forms of collective action laid the foundation for later movements advocating women's labor rights, suffrage, and equality. Industrialization had pulled women into the public sphere, marking the beginning of a profound social transformation. While industrial work gave women visibility and income, it also exposed them to profound exploitation. The factory system prioritized production over safety or well-being. Children and women often worked together, enduring exhausting schedules that left little time for rest or education. In coal mines, textile mills, and domestic workshops, accidents were frequent and medical care was minimal. Many women developed chronic ailments due to repetitive labor, poor ventilation, and long hours. Women's wages were a fraction of men's, reflecting societal perceptions of gender and labor. Employers justified low pay by claiming that women worked alongside men and their earnings were supplementary. Yet in reality, many women were primary breadwinners, supporting families with the income they earned. This economic exploitation became a source of tension, both within households and within society at large, as women increasingly recognized the need for collective advocacy. Labor activism among women grew steadily. In Britain, strikes and protests in textile towns drew attention to unsafe conditions, low pay, and excessive hours. Social reformers, often motivated by religious or humanitarian ideals, highlighted the plight of women and children, advocating for laws that limited working hours, prohibited night labor, and improved factory safety. While resistance from employers and government was fierce, these movements slowly established the principle that industrial growth must be accompanied by social responsibility. The struggle for recognition extended beyond the factory floor. Women began to challenge societal norms that limited education, voting rights, and political participation. Industrialization had created a paradox. It offered women opportunity, yet simultaneously exploited and constrained them. Their experiences in the industrial workforce became the crucible in which ideas about gender, labor, and social justice were forged. By the late 19th century, women's labor in industrial society had catalyzed broader social reform and early feminist movements. Activists recognized that economic empowerment and political rights were intertwined. Organizations advocating for women's suffrage, education, and legal equality gained momentum across Europe and North America. Figures such as Emmeline Pankhurst in Britain and Susan B. Anthony in the United States combined advocacy for political rights with campaigns for fair labor practices. Social reformers targeted industrial working conditions. Legislation began to limit child labor, regulate working hours for women, and enforce factory inspections. Education became central to empowerment, with programs for literacy, vocational training, and higher learning providing women with the tools to participate fully in the modern economy. Philanthropic efforts complemented these reforms, creating housing, health initiatives, and communal resources for working women. The cultural impact of women in industry was profound. Their presence in factories, offices, and workshops challenged traditional gender norms. They became visible participants in public life, asserting agency in both economic and social spheres. Industrialization had pulled women out of the domestic sphere and placed them at the center of labor, politics, and reform movements. Their struggle highlighted the moral and social responsibilities inherent in industrial progress, demonstrating that human dignity and economic efficiency must coexist. By the turn of the 20th century, women had laid the groundwork for the modern feminist movement. Industrial labor had been both a crucible of exploitation and a platform for empowerment. Women's contributions to the workforce, their resilience, and their advocacy reshaped society, proving that industrialization was not only a story of machines and markets, but also a story of human courage, social justice, and the relentless pursuit of equality. Few inventions defined the Industrial Revolution as profoundly as the steam engine. James Watt's improvements to Thomas Newcomen's original design in the late 18th century turned a laborious, inefficient pump into a versatile machine capable of driving factories, mills, and locomotives. The steam engine unleashed energy at a scale previously unimaginable, replacing human and animal labor with mechanical force. Factories no longer needed to be near rivers for water power. They could be built anywhere, transforming urban landscapes and expanding industrial activity. Mines benefited enormously, as steam engines could pump water from ever deeper shafts, allowing coal extraction to scale dramatically. The symbiosis between steam power and coal created a self-reinforcing industrial ecosystem. Coal powered the engines. Engines enabled factories, and factories produced goods for a growing market. Steam power also revolutionized transportation. Locomotives and steamboats multiplied the speed and capacity of trade, shrinking distances between markets and raw materials. Railways expanded across continents, while steamships crossed oceans faster than ever before. Industrialization had become mobile, spreading its effects globally. Beyond physical power, the steam engine symbolized the human triumph over nature, a machine that could extract, move, and transform energy at unprecedented efficiency. Its influence extended far beyond factories, catalyzing the rise of industrial cities, global commerce, and technological ambition. While the steam engine supplied power, mechanization transformed production itself. The textile industry led the way. Inventions like the spinning jenny, water frame, and power loom mechanized processes that had previously required years of skilled labor. Cotton, wool, and flax could be spun and woven at previously unimaginable speed, fueling the growth of textile towns in Britain and later across Europe and the United States. Mechanized production created economies of scale, dramatically lowering costs and expanding markets. Factories could produce in bulk, and urban populations now had access to affordable clothing, textiles, and other consumer goods. Machines also standardized quality, reducing human error and increasing efficiency. While this revolutionized industry, it came at a human cost. Traditional artisans lost livelihoods, and factory workers endured long hours and harsh conditions. Mechanization extended beyond textiles. Metalworking, printing, and food processing adopted machines that replaced hand labor. Innovations like the mechanical reaper, steam-powered presses, and automated looms multiplied output while demanding precision, skill, and oversight. This era marked the first large-scale interaction between humans and machines in daily production. Work itself became synchronized with the rhythms of machines, and society adapted to this new tempo. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, was not merely the story of engines or iron. It was a story of mechanized human labor reshaped by ingenuity, power, and relentless efficiency. Technological innovation during the Industrial Revolution was not confined to mechanical production. Communication, knowledge transfer, and energy transmission also advanced dramatically, laying the groundwork for the modern world. The telegraph, invented by Samuel Morse in the 1830s and 1840s, allowed messages to travel across continents in minutes. This revolutionized commerce, diplomacy, and social interaction, shrinking the world intellectually as well as physically. Electricity, though initially experimental, became a cornerstone of technological progress by the late 19th century. Early generators and dynamos transformed industrial operations, powering lighting, motors, and telecommunication systems. Cities were illuminated, factories ran longer and more efficiently, and human activity expanded into night hours. Innovations in electrical engineering, pioneered by inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, set the stage for the 20th century's technological explosion. Industrial innovation was cumulative. Each invention, steam engines, mechanized looms, telegraphs, electrical motors, built upon previous discoveries, creating a network of interdependent technologies that transformed everyday life. Factories became more productive, cities more connected, and societies more interdependent. Technology no longer served merely as a tool. It shaped the rhythm of life, the organization of labor, and the possibilities of human achievement. The Industrial Revolution, through its innovations, had not only mechanized work, but had mechanized the very structures of modern civilization, creating a world defined by speed, connectivity, and unprecedented capability. The rise of industrial cities transformed more than work and economy. It transformed human imagination. Factories, smokestacks, and crowded tenements became central motifs in literature, painting, and photography. Artists sought to capture the unprecedented scale, energy, and chaos of urban life. Painters of the Romantic movement, like J.M.W. Turner, depicted the sublime collision of nature and industrialization. Ships powered by steam plowing through rivers, smoke rising from coal-fired factories, and bridges arching across newly industrialized landscapes. Literature offered both fascination and critique. Authors like Charles Dickens chronicled the stark inequalities of industrial society. Children toiling in factories, families crushed by poverty, and the morally complex landscape of urban life. Dickens' works, such as Hard Times and Oliver Twist, reflected the human cost of rapid industrialization, forcing society to confront the consequences of progress. Meanwhile, Romantic poets mourned the loss of pastoral life, expressing tension between industrial growth and nature's beauty. Industrialization, for artists and writers, became both subject and lens, shaping aesthetic and ethical exploration. Photography emerged as a new medium, documenting the industrial age with unflinching realism. Early photographers captured the grim interiors of factories, bustling streets, and the harsh living conditions of urban workers. These visual records created a cultural archive of industrial society, allowing future generations to see the interplay between innovation, labor, and daily life. Art, literature, and photography together made the Industrial Revolution not only a technological and economic event, but a cultural and emotional one, reflecting the human experience in all its complexity. Industrialization also influenced music, theater, and communal forms of expression. As cities expanded, traditional folk music blended with urban themes, capturing the rhythms and stories of industrial life. Work songs, laments, and protest hymns became part of the cultural fabric of factory towns and mining communities. Music offered both solace and solidarity, allowing workers to express their experiences and build shared identities amid grueling labor conditions. Theater responded similarly. Plays staged in industrial cities often depicted social inequality, child labor, and family struggles. The theater became a forum for social critique and entertainment, offering reflections on industrial society that resonated with audiences. Audiences could see themselves or their neighbors represented on stage, forging empathy and awareness across social classes. Dramatic literature, both realistic and symbolic, addressed the tensions between progress, morality, and the human condition. Public lecture halls and literary societies proliferated, democratizing access to intellectual and artistic engagement. Working-class citizens could attend lectures on science, literature, and social reform, while libraries and reading rooms provided spaces for self-education. Cultural life thus became intertwined with education, social awareness, and political consciousness. Industrialization reshaped not only work and city life, but also the ways humans engage with ideas, art, and each other, making culture a vehicle for both critique and imagination. The cultural transformation of the Industrial Revolution went hand in hand with social critique and reform. Literature, journalism, and public discourse illuminated the stark inequalities created by industrialization, pressing governments and society to respond. Social novels, investigative journalism, and satirical writing exposed poor working conditions, child labor, and the environmental consequences of industrial growth. Figures such as Elizabeth Gaskell and Benjamin Disraeli offered nuanced portrayals of the human impact of industry, blending storytelling with social conscience. Visual culture reinforced these critiques. Artists and early photojournalists captured the urban landscape and industrial labor conditions, creating a shared awareness of society's responsibilities. Public exhibitions, like the Great Exhibition of 1851, celebrated technological achievement while prompting reflection on ethical and social questions. Who benefited from progress? And at what cost? Industrialization had created a world of abundance. Yet abundance coexisted with poverty, disease, and inequality, demanding both artistic and societal attention. Ultimately, culture became a mirror and mediator of the industrial age. Art, literature, music, and theater reflected human resilience, creativity, and suffering. They documented change, challenged assumptions, and inspired reform. The Industrial Revolution, through its machines, cities, and social upheavals, had reshaped not only work and society, but the human imagination itself. Culture became a vehicle for understanding, interpreting, and humanizing a world in rapid transformation, ensuring that technological progress did not entirely overshadow human experience. Industrialization brought immense power and productivity, but it came at a staggering environmental cost. Coal-powered factories, ironworks, and steam engines filled urban skies with smoke and soot, transforming the atmosphere in ways previously unimaginable. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Pittsburgh became synonymous with smog, a dense mixture of coal smoke, dust, and chemical pollutants that darkened streets and caused respiratory illness. Rivers, once sources of drinking water and transportation, became open sewers. Factories discharged chemicals, dyes, and untreated waste directly into streams and canals. Fish populations dwindled, waterborne diseases proliferated, and communities dependent on rivers suffered profound consequences. In some industrial hubs, rivers changed color permanently, reflecting the toxic byproducts of mechanical production. The environmental cost was not limited to air and water. Forests were cleared for fuel, urban expansion, and infrastructure projects, altering ecosystems and displacing wildlife. Mining operations scarred landscapes, leaving open pits, slag heaps, and contaminated soils. Industrialization created a new environmental reality, a human-altered world in which the natural rhythms of air, water, and land were subordinated to the demands of production and profit. These changes prompted both immediate and long-term consequences for human health, food security, and ecological balance. Industrialization also radically increased humanity's demand for resources. Coal became the lifeblood of factories, railways, and steamships, fueling the engines of progress, but consuming landscapes and ecosystems. Iron, copper, and other metals were mined at an unprecedented scale, feeding machines, railways, and construction projects. The extraction of these resources transformed entire regions, with laborers facing dangerous working conditions, while mountains and forests were depleted. Agricultural practices shifted to meet industrial needs as well. Mechanized farming increased crop yields, but also encouraged monoculture, soil exhaustion, and deforestation. Urban expansion demanded timber, stone, and bricks, further depleting natural resources. Industrial society had become a voracious consumer, extracting energy and materials at a pace that nature could scarcely replenish. These demands also had social and political implications. Access to coal, iron, and raw materials shaped industrial competitiveness, influencing international trade, colonial expansion, and geopolitical power. Nations competed for resources, exploiting colonies and territories to fuel their own industrial growth. Environmental transformation, therefore, was intertwined with economic ambition and imperial power, illustrating how industrialization reshaped not only landscapes, but global political and economic systems. Although environmental consciousness was limited during the early Industrial Revolution, the consequences of pollution, deforestation, and urban crowding eventually prompted awareness and action. Social reformers, writers, and scientists began documenting the health impacts of polluted air and water, linking industrial practices to disease, mortality, and social unrest. Physicians, journalists, and naturalists drew attention to the degradation of rivers, forests, and urban environments, raising ethical questions about humanity's relationship with nature. By the late 19th century, public health and environmental concerns began to intersect. Urban planning, sanitation infrastructure, and factory regulations were partially motivated by the desire to mitigate environmental damage. Laws limiting industrial emissions, protecting waterways, and regulating waste disposal slowly emerged, although enforcement remained inconsistent. The Industrial Revolution had exposed the fragile balance between progress and preservation, illustrating that technological achievement came with responsibility. Culturally, the environmental impact of industrialization inspired artistic and literary reflection. Romantic poets, naturalists, and writers mourned the loss of unspoiled landscapes, warning of the cost of unchecked industrial expansion. Art and literature became early vehicles for environmental critique, encouraging society to consider the consequences of exploiting nature for profit. Industrialization had mechanized labor, society, and knowledge, but it also mechanized nature itself, forcing humanity to confront the limits of consumption and the moral dimensions of progress. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally transformed human society, reshaping daily life, social structures, and global dynamics. Urbanization accelerated as factories, mines, and mills drew millions into cities. Traditional agrarian lifestyles were disrupted, giving rise to new social hierarchies, labor markets, and cultural dynamics. Cities became centers of commerce, innovation, and cultural exchange, while the countryside adapted to industrial demands through mechanized agriculture and new trade networks. Education, literacy, and technical knowledge emerged as essential tools for navigating the industrial world. Schools, apprenticeships, and universities produced engineers, managers, and skilled workers, while public libraries and educational societies democratized access to information. Literacy rates soared, giving rise to a more informed populace capable of participating in political, economic, and cultural life. Industrial society was not only powered by machines, but also by knowledge, as the ability to learn, adapt, and innovate became crucial to survival and success. Industrialization also created a new social consciousness. Labor movements, social reformers, and advocacy networks arose to challenge exploitation, fight for workers' rights, and promote public health. Women and children gradually gained legal protections and educational opportunities, signaling the slow, uneven emergence of modern social justice. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrial society had established principles that continue to shape modern governance. The necessity of labor rights, the importance of public welfare, and the moral responsibility of industry to society. Industrialization, therefore, was not just a technological revolution. It was a profound social and ethical transformation. The technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution laid the foundation for the modern world. Steam power, mechanization, electricity, and communication networks transformed the pace and scale of human activity. Railways, steamships, telegraphs, and later electricity created a world interconnected economically, politically, and culturally. Distance no longer constrained trade, migration, or ideas. Nations and continents became interdependent in unprecedented ways. Industrialization also initiated the globalization of production and commerce. Raw materials flowed from colonies to industrial centers. Goods traveled to markets across the world, and labor migrations reshaped societies. Economies became tightly linked, forming the precursors to the modern global economy. Industrial innovation was cumulative. Each invention built upon previous discoveries, creating feedback loops that accelerated productivity, technological growth, and scientific understanding. Modern industries, urban centers, and global trade networks are direct descendants of these 18th and 19th century developments. Perhaps most importantly, the Industrial Revolution demonstrated the transformative power of human ingenuity. Societies learned that technological progress could generate both prosperity and peril, innovation and inequality. This duality remains central to modern life. Cities are hubs of production and culture. Transportation and communication bind people across continents, and technological advancement continues to drive social and economic change. The Industrial Revolution set the stage for the digital age, providing lessons in innovation, adaptation, and the ethical responsibility of progress. Beyond machinery, markets, and urbanization, the Industrial Revolution is a story of humanity, of labor, courage, adaptation, and creativity. Millions of lives were transformed. Children labored in factories. Women entered industrial workforces. Artisans adapted to mechanized production, and workers organized to assert rights and dignity. Social, cultural, and political structures evolve alongside technology, reshaping human relationships and societal norms. Industrialization also forced humans to confront consequences of progress. Environmental degradation, public health crises, and urban overcrowding demonstrated that growth without foresight could be catastrophic. Reform, regulation, and activism emerged as essential mechanisms for balancing prosperity with human welfare. The lessons of the Industrial Revolution, responsibility, innovation, solidarity, and adaptation remain relevant today as modern societies grapple with technological change, social inequality, and environmental challenges. Ultimately, the Industrial Revolution created the blueprint of the modern world. It mechanized labor, transformed cities, globalized commerce, and sparked social movements. It expanded human knowledge, catalyzed cultural evolution, and connected continents through technology. It is a story of triumph and struggle, of human ingenuity and ethical reckoning. The legacy of this era endures not merely in factories, machines, and inventions, but in the human capacity to innovate, reflect, and shape a world that balances progress with humanity, reminding us that every advance carries responsibility to people, society, and the planet. You've just traveled through the epic story of the Industrial Revolution with History Teller YT, a journey through steam, steel, innovation, and human resilience. Today, we've seen how machines transformed societies, how labor fought for rights, how women and children stepped into new roles, and how culture, education, and technology reshaped the world forever. The moral of this story is clear. Progress comes with both opportunity and responsibility. Innovation can create wealth and transform lives, but without compassion, foresight, and justice, it can also bring hardship and inequality. The Industrial Revolution teaches us that human ingenuity is powerful, but it is the choices we make for society, for workers, for the environment, that determine whether progress benefits everyone. If you found this journey enlightening, inspiring, or thought-provoking, stay tuned with History Teller YT for more stories from the past that continue to shape the world we live in today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next exploration into history's greatest events. Join us again as we uncover the people, ideas, and inventions that changed humanity, one story at a time.